Uh-huh.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Paul Gilgee. Welcome to another of our great sessions on the history of families coming to America from Norway and where they are today. We've got a great session planned here today, and we're so happy that you are all with us. We're going to today be featuring on the Beaver family, one of the earliest families in Rolette County. And we have two or three of the family members who will be sharing it. Randy Lee will be leading the production, and then he will be assisted by Michael Beaver and Michael Oyseth. So, Randy, thank you so much. You're raring to go. Go to it.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. I hope people enjoy this next rendition. And of course, my two Michael assistants here, feel free to jump in at any time. I know Michael Beaver, you might be a little dizzy having to come down off the ceiling, but we'll make do.
I'll be standing
So,
there pushing on the floor, standing on my head. That's
so here we have the Beaver family, Fra Norga till America. So this is the land that our beaver ancestors left in Norway. As you can see, it's quite beautiful. They were probably looking for a place that might have snow and lakes and things like that. So they were going to head west to see if they could find it. Lots of water. It's a beautiful land over there. Not all of them left, but they took their traditions with them. And here we have Kongsberg, Norway, where they are from in Norway. It's their ancestral home. And we say they lived here for at least 300 years that we know of. We can trace them back to the 1600s, but I'm sure they were there before. We just don't have the records quite yet because Michael Oyseth hasn't finished all that yet, but I'm sure we'll continue to find evidence. In case you're wondering where Kongsberg is within Norway, here it is. As you can see, it's southwest of Oslo. And by cart, I don't know how long it would take to get there, but it was an hour or two by car.
Interesting name, Randy. Is it related? Did the king have a homestead there or what?
Kongsberg, yes, is the city of the king. And when we get to the church, we'll see a little bit more. But yes, it was in honor of the king.
Thank you.
He had some mines there, etc. We were ably assisted in our research in Norway. The charge was led, of course, by Mike Oyseth and others, as well as family members who provided a lot of history. Ultimately, Mike Oyseth and other family members put us in touch with a researcher there by the name of Turid Jensen. And here is a picture of me with Turid. She had written this history book, which provided a lot of detail about our family members in Norway. Here you can see it says Grendebok for Bevergrenda I Kongsberg. And so it's quite a lot of research he's done. Here's a little tidbit on the right here of some of the elements of the book. And you can see on the right-hand side, the years 1840, 1853, we have Morten Olsen Hugsted Bever and his widow as property owners of this land called Bevergrenda. And interesting, in Norway, this researcher focused mostly on the land itself and not necessarily on the residents. The residents were important to show the history of the land. So if you read through this book, it's in Norwegian, but there's Michael Oyseth and others doing a yeoman's job in making the translations. And it describes the background of the area and how it transformed, the ownership transformed over time. So in Kongsberg, our Beaver family, along with many other families, were silver miners. And so this is called the King's Mine. There were many other mines in the area and deep underground, as you can imagine. So these miner family members of ours would walk or take a cart from their family farms in Bevergrenda or Hugsted out to this area. And the silver miners likely would stay for a few days or a week and come home on the weekends to their farms. Oftentimes those farms were subsistence farms, not the huge farms that we're familiar with here in America today. So um, this is the first part of the homestead called Hugstead, Norway. It is just north of Kongsberg, and we were very fortunate that Turid Jensen, not only did she write the book, but she gave us her full day, took us around to all of the sites in the area of Kongsberg and on up to Hugstead. And you can see this homestead where our family members once lived. And as you can see, it looks a bit like Norway. I will make a comment that she told us that probably in those days when our folks were there would have been no trees here because the trees were chopped down to make firewood that they used in the mines to heat up the ground in order to break the rock because the rock was very difficult to get through. And with a hammer and chisel, as they used in most days, it took them an extraordinary amount of time. But they found that if they heated the rock and broke the rock in that manner, that it would yield the silver more readily. So there weren't many trees back then, but of course by now, they've grown up. This is Beaver. This is the land that Martin Beaver and his family moved down to from Hoogstead, and it was the last place they lived in Kongsberg before they emigrated to the New World. This is a picture of it in 2017, and kind of unique little building here that I'm describing is called a stabur, right here in the center. And as you can see, it's kind of an unusual raised second section above, and it's gone on pillars, and it's where they would store grain and hang meat and things like that for the wintertime. And here's another picture on the site of Bevergrunda, and it is a barn. As you can see, it's got an incline here for the cattle to go into the wintertime up into the upper portion where they could have the hay, much like we do here in the Midwest in the winter. This is quite ornate inside of the Kongsberg Church, and our Beaver ancestors occupied this church for all of their important ceremonies from birth, confirmation, marriages, and death ceremonies for over 300 years. We're very fortunate to get a tour of this church and see the sites that our folks had seen for many, many generations. Now, the silver miners weren't always clean when they came from work, or if they weren't always gonna be as well received by the landed gentry, and so they had them come in the back entrance and go up these back steps and occupy the seating on your left, this sort of stadium seating. And the picture on the right shows the view of the stadium seating down onto the landed gentry folk
That's a
on the right.
magnificent picture, Randy. Congratulations. How old is that church?
This particular church is about 300 years old. There
Okay.
was a church prior to that, and so this is quote unquote the new church. So,
Thank you.
and speaking of the patriarch and matriarch, this is essentially the matriarch of the family just before they came over to the New World. So here they are, occupants of Bevergrunda. Martin Olsen Beaver died in Norway. He had been on the land for about a dozen years or so, and his widow Rolette inherited the land from him. And during that time, there was a great excitement about Scandinavians immigrating to the New World, where there were possibilities of land and new opportunities that weren't as present in Norway at the time. And so the family got as excited as all of their counterparts in heading for the New World. So Alet's whole family ultimately decided to join that surge to the New World. So here is a listing of, in fact, the family, Morten Olsen Beaver and Alet Karina Olesdatter. So as you can see, they had about 10 kids, Gurina, Oli, Christian, Polly, Hulver, Ingeborg, Olaus, Anna, Anna Katerina, Maren, and Martinius. The last child died not long after birth. So the rest of them, however, ultimately all came to the New World.
I think that's kind of an interesting thing too, because in the research that I've done, there weren't too many families where an entire group of as many as 10 children all emigrated and came to the US. Oftentimes there'd be 3 or 4 or so that would stay back in Norway. They would marry there and continue to live in Norway in some place. So kind of unique in a way that all 10 plus their mother came.
Yeah. And of course, as Mike indicated, some of them married there, as did the oldest, Gurina. She married a couple times in Norway. And so she was,
Garina was the only one who was married before she emigrated. Both husbands died in Norway. We do have a boyfriend and girlfriend that came though, and that was Anand and his wife were both from the Kongsberg area. They came separately to the US and then married up in Becker County. But they had known each other back around Kongsberg.
So with Grina being married and the oldest, ultimately her entry to the New World was delayed while the younger ones went ahead. And we'll start that here.
Randy, just for the benefit of the people who aren't terribly well informed, we just to emphasize that Garina is the mother of Andrew Beaver, who settled in Rolette. And so Rolette was his grandmother, right?
That is absolutely true.
Okay, thank you. Okay, keep
going.
Thank
you for the clarification. So here we are, our intrepid first, the leaders of our family immigration process. The 3 gentlemen at the bottom, from left to right, we have Polly, Christian, and Oli. And the women behind may be the wives or a sister. We're not quite sure. Mike Oiseth's still working on that one, aren't you, Mike?
Yeah, it could take some time.
But these are the intrepid explorers at the bottom. They started the family immigration. And so here we have sort of a depiction of that immigration from Norway across to the New World. Mike, you want to walk through a little bit of the transition of how this went?
Yes, okay. Well, Tolly, he was the 3rd oldest son and the 4th child in the family, but he was the most adventurous in some ways, and we know that he came aboard the Sjofna in 1857 along with someone who was in his confirmation class, not as far as we know so far, not a blood relative, but a neighbor, John F. Beaver. And John happened to enlist in the Union Army during the Civil War, the 15th Wisconsin Regiment. And so they were 2 pretty adventurous guys. And we see the other dates here where immigration of individuals or maybe a couple at a time, siblings came. In 1870, Alet and some of her children and
his sister Ingeborg,
sisters, plural, came over. And that was kind of engineered by Tolly, who in 1869 went back to Kongsberg, spent a few months over winter there, and in the spring 1870 he brought his mother and a couple sisters over to the US. Now all these people traveled by way of Quebec, and that might be a surprise to some folks listening, but beginning in the late 1840s, Quebec began to be the most desirable port in North America for Norwegian immigrants. There were more Norwegians who went to Quebec than to New York until about 1875. One reason for that was economic. I guess the shipping companies were able to haul lumber from Canada back to England and make a pretty good profit doing that as part of their back and forth across the ocean. 1875 we could highlight because that's when Garina and her children came over in a group. They came by way of Quebec again. And on the map to the left there, you can see where the general route was Quebec to Montreal area and then east toward the Great Lakes. And from what I've read over and over again, various routes existed there from that part of the country into the Midwest, but basically it was a combination of traveling aboard smaller boats on the Great Lakes and or on rail from point to point between cities. One of the main ones being down to Chicago. And then sometimes they would take a boat up toward Wisconsin and Lake Michigan. My great-grandfather, Ole Beaver, came that way. He declared on one of his naturalization documents that he had entered the US at the port of Wisconsin, or port of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now,
Oh, what a gorgeous day.
Milwaukee is really not an official port of immigration, but it was an entry point. Excuse me.
You got it, it's a little heavy, okay. The little plate underneath there, I'll put those on, and then
Frederica,
Oh, okay.
I'm just gonna leave my.
Wonderful, yeah.
mute yourself, Frederica, mute yourself.
Oh,
And then I'll go
I'm
to
sorry.
share, and oh, this is perfect. 1 year.
So I'll just point out, in addition to what, to add to Mike's comments, Marina's oldest son, Martin Beaver, my great-grandfather, came in 1870 with his grandmother and aunts. All right,
Okay,
so you want to talk about this one, Michael?
well, this is my most prized possession in my genealogy research, and this happened to come down through my Beaver ancestors. It is a document called an attest or a testimonial that was written up by the parish pastor in Kongsberg for my great-grandfather, Ole, back in 1858. And this is a photo of the original document, which I have a copy of. So it's a pretty valuable and unique thing. But these attests were issued to anyone in Norway moving from one parish to another, or when immigration began, moving from somewhere in Norway to an unknown location in America. And the idea was to introduce the person to the new pastor and say, he is of this parentage and he was born on this date and baptized on such and such. And we know he was confirmed in our church here on this date. And it happens to mention this one, happens to mention that he had his inoculation for smallpox and so on. Immigrants from Norway were supposed to always work through their parish pastor and let them know of their intentions to leave. We know it's not possible that all of them did so, but many, many did. And when they out-migrated, they received some kind of a document. I have heard that in Wisconsin, there were some churches, old, early churches out in the country that had safes that were finally opened, and there were inside those safes stacks of these kinds of documents brought by various parishioners who came from Norway at various points.
Michael, Paul Gilgy here, just two interesting comments. One
Uh-huh.
is that the name Thorn is an interesting name, or Thorna.
Yes,
1905, one of the towns near Rolette plotted on the railroad was named Thorn. I'll
You're
bet you
right.
Andrew had a role in planting that name.
you're
The other
correct.
is the other is what marvelous handwriting Pastor Thorna had.
Yes, you can read it.
I will say that here it's
Better
a
than some of
test.
some of the records that you read in the parish records, but this is quite legible.
So it's a testimony to the good moral character of Ole, and I wish all of us could get the same.
I'm just sort of amazed that, you think of the thousands of immigrants from Norway who were to use this process of exiting the country, go to their pastor and register their intentions to leave, and then they would get a document of this type. I think the later ones were a little bit more templates and fill in the blank type documents, but think of the numbers of times that a pastor had to sit down with an immigrant or immigrant family and make out all these documents. How tiresome that would be, and how really kind of disappointing it must have felt for all of the people leaving the parishes. I've reflected on that a number of times. It must have been a very disheartening period for the pastors too.
Yeah. And of course, they were up against something like this, an advertisement to come to America and see the great wonders of the New World. So here's the advertisement to come down to Porsgrunn, Norway, and step aboard the sailing ship, the Scherfna. And so Polly did. And here's a picture of the Scherfna that brought the first members of the Beaver family directly from Norway to Quebec, Canada. And as you can imagine, by such a voyage would be fraught with peril and uh, subject to the whims of the wind and waves. So this particular trip that Tolly took left in April and got here by the 1st of June, so just over a month, but others would take 2 months or even more, depending on whether you had the wind or the waves in your favor. So later years, our family traveled across for a period of up to 15 years, and by the later portion of that, they had more consistent transportation, more reliable, and we'll get to that in a moment. So here we see that. This is the ship called the Angelo. And so by the time Gurina Beaver brought her children over in 1875, they had established a system of feeder ships, small steamships that would take them from Norway to England, where they could catch a larger transatlantic steamship to go on to the New World. So in this case, Oslo was the primary embarkation point for Green and her family, and they transported them to Hull, England, on the east side of England. Here's a transient barracks base, basically, where families would disembark from those feeder ships and stay here maybe for a day or a few days, depending on whether they could get the next mode of transportation, which was usually rail, to a couple of other ports where they would catch the transatlantic steamships. Liverpool was a common one, Glasgow, London. In the case of Verena and her children, they went to Glasgow. So and caught a larger steamship from there. Others members of the Beaver family had taken similar feeder ships. There's a line of them that would operate in the same manner, and I believe they just went back and forth and back and forth and brought them here. Once they had disembarked here and gotten on the rail and taken them to, in this case, Glasgow, they boarded the Waldensian. And so here we have it in late April. Irene and her family boarded the Waldensian. And this time, instead of over a month, it took them about 3 weeks. And so they arrived in Quebec in the middle of May 1875. Here's a glimpse of Quebec during that time frame, where you can see the tall ships in the back, a major entry port, as Mike pointed out, for North America. And so, as he relayed, they could get other modes of transportation across. This is an example of what you could take all of your worldly possessions to the New World with you. In this case, it was owned by Tina Bren. And as you can see, it says here on the right in Norwegian in a way, Minnesota, North America, 1876. Tina Bren, Audubon, Becker County in western Minnesota. So
I will interject that these trunks were also used in earlier decades crossing on these sailing ships, and it was required that passengers fill these trunks greatly with the food that they would be consuming across the ocean. So they have to bring, prepared food that would not be perishable and that they could haul along with them. They were allowed some cooking facilities up on the deck, and they had to take turns and rotate, their use of those in order to prepare meals for themselves.
Just
you
like
can imagine it
modern day
being
cruise ships. Just
What was
like,
you
that?
can imagine being, yeah,
I said, it's just like the modern day cruise ships, yeah.
you can imagine being full of lefse.
Yeah,
And we're fortunate. Mike always took this picture years ago for us. And just the other day, we were able to meet with Megan Nord, who is Morgan Beaver's daughter, who currently owns this and has it in her basement. So how many years had it been since you'd seen Megan, Michael?
Oh, I think it was about 2001 or two that I was up there to visit Morgan and his family. Yeah.
Yeah. So still helping to maintain those connections between the family. Thank you, Michael. So coming from Quebec City, they first point of opportunity they had to really settle in the New World was here in Wisconsin, as Mike described, where they did settle for about 7 years as they began to learn how to not just do the subsistence farming they had done in Norway, but to really work on large farms. And Mike, you want to make any comment about who they worked for there?
Warren Gilbert was one who was from, I believe, New York. He was a Yankee, not a Norwegian. And John Beaver, I think, worked on a very prosperous farm that specialized in raising horses, actually. So they were pretty sophisticated farmers that were doing well. And these young guys from Norway got an introduction to how it was done, how it could be done in the US, very differently from what they had known back in Norway. And that was in Columbia County, Wisconsin, which is north of Dane County, if you happen to know where that. Dane County is the county in which Madison exists. And that's the location they first spent time before they made a decision to go to Minnesota in 1863. By 1863, Minnesota had been receiving many Norwegian immigrants directly from Norway and or many numbers that were located in places like Muskego and Koshkonong in Dane County and Rock County, Wisconsin. Those were filling up and becoming very high priced as far as the cost of land and so on. So there was a real trend that developed by the 1860s when Norwegian immigration rates really started to rise quickly. That was really the beginning of mass migration from Norway. And those many people moving into the southeastern part of Minnesota and beyond. And that's when the three brothers, Ole and Polly and Christian, and then their friend John F. Beaver, who was back from the Civil War service. He had been discharged due to illness in the war, but he returned back to Wisconsin, and the four of them then went to Dodge County, Minnesota, and found land. There was not homestead land available anymore. That had already been taken prior to the Homestead Act, which went into effect in 1863. So they bought land from previous owners.
So thank you. So those three brothers stayed and started their families and set down their roots. And then eventually, as the other family members came, they all came through to Dodge County, where the Beaver family had established those roots in order to get some support from them and then decide where they might go next. So those three brothers, two of the three brothers, Ole and Christian, essentially stayed there and decided this was a good place for them, and they were going to populate Dodge County.
Well,
of course,
Tolly also.
yes, absolutely. And Tolly did have land there, and we'll see that.
Now,
But Tolly also,
their
go ahead.
friend John, back from the Civil War, stayed a while in Dodge County, but then he went over to Freeborn County, Minnesota, got himself married in 1869, and he was the pathfinder who headed up to Becker County. He was kind of the explorer on that destination. And once he was up there, he must have communicated back by letters or something to let Ole and Tolly and Christian know there's good land up here, good opportunities. And so the other immigrants in the family coming through Dodge County were directed to go try Becker County out. And that's where many of them ended up living pretty permanently.
So Halvor and Anand and Alette and eventually Gurina and all of them came up into Becker County. And then many of them settled there and stayed. And then ultimately, a few of them, Gurina's family primarily, went on into North Dakota. And we'll get to that in a minute. But this is sort of the overview of how they came, and various members of the Beaver family planted themselves in different sections of the Midwest, as you can see here.
Right.
So we'll describe a little bit of the Beaver family that came from Norway. We mentioned Gurina. Here we have Ole Mortensen, who came here, and you can see he raised a family in Dodge County and stayed there. And ultimately, Mike Oiseth is a descendant of that family.
Mhm.
Here is essentially a immigration record
Well, it's a
whereby
naturalization. It's a naturalization declaration.
Sure, whereby a new immigrant would have to declare that they, in fact, were going to be a loyal American and renounce any fidelity or allegiance they might have had to their former lands. In this case, Oscar the First, sovereign of Norway, is somebody they said they were no longer going to be in allegiance to. That was Ole, and Gurina had a similar one here in 1883. where she is swearing that she will be a good citizen and no longer going to act in service of the King of Sweden and Norway in this case, before Norway got its independence around 1905. The next brother is Christian Mortensen Beaver, and this is his family. And he was one of the three brothers who came, and he too stayed in Dodge County largely and set a great homestead there and his lands that he purchased. And these are his descendants. And we'll get to Robert Beaver, one of his descendants, who was also another researcher who helped us with this. And now we have Anna Katrina Mortensdatter. And here's a picture of her, which has its own unique history. You want to tell a little bit about that, Michael?
Well, I just within the last year received this photo from someone who out on the West Coast around Bellingham, Washington area, I believe, has a hobby of going to flea markets and other auctions or whatever locations where she can look through old photographs that have been discarded by families, and if they have names on them or some clue as to who the person might be or where it was taken, she tries to match them up with family trees that she finds online, for instance, at ancestry.com. And she contacted me and said, I have a beaver photo that is in my possession. I'll be glad to send it to anyone who has a family connection. So I wrote back to her and she mailed it to me and would not take any payments. So that's what you call random acts of genealogical kindness. There's an organization called that. She's not necessarily affiliated with that, but I call that random acts of genealogical kindness, where we were able to acquire this photo of someone we had no previous early photo of. So kind of fun to know that people are willing to do that.
Thank you for that. Here is another picture of Anna Katrina and her family. They were another one that settled in Becker County, Minnesota. Then we have another sibling, Ingeborg Christina Beaver. And so you want to talk about this one as well, Michael? You had a comment on there.
A little bit. You want to show the next slide, don't you? I think.
Sure.
Maybe.
There we go.
Now, we don't have a picture of Ingeborg, but we do have this photo that we're quite sure about, and that shows Ingeborg married Charlie Martin. And they lived in Becker County, but they did go over to Rolette County by 1885. They were residents there. But anyway, she had two daughters with Charlie. One was Alpha and another daughter, Elise or Lisa. And both daughters married second cousins, Speeton men. And this happens to be Johannes Speeton there. And they were obviously descendants of Ingeborg and had quite a large family. I've heard so much from the Speetons in Minnesota and Illinois.
Thank you. So
By
now
the
we
way,
have,
I'm going to interject one little thing here, Randy, and that is just a comment about if you go to that list of the children. Yeah. We're looking at people with a name with the patronymic Mortensen or Mortensdatter. All of them would have that attached. Even Ingeborg Christine would be a Mortensdatter Beaver. Now, in the Norwegian naming tradition, you were given that name after your father's first name, son of Morton, daughter of Morton, etc. And then they tacked on the farm name, which is a little bit like an address. It is not so much like a surname, but more like an address. So it would be like Garina Marie Morton's daughter of such and such a place. Ole Mortensen, who is of Beaver in Buskerud, Norway, etc. Now, when immigrants came from Norway, they had choices to make, adapting to the American naming system, because there were no traditions similar to the Norwegian ones here in the US. They could choose, do they want to go by their farm name, Beaver, or did they want to retain their name, their patronymic, Mortensen? And I just want to make the point that all of us today who are related to the Beavers could have been Mortensens rather than Beavers. And just
Yeah.
for fun,
Sure.
I looked in the 1880 Census of the United States to see how many Norwegians were living in the US in 1880 with the name Mortensen spelled either S-E-N or S-O-N at the end. There were 934 Mortensens scattered across mostly the Midwest United States. We might have been one of those, but we were not.
Good point. Just as Morten Olsen, before he was Beaver, he was Morten Olsen Hugstead, and then became Morten Olsen Beaver when he moved to that farm.
Yes,
So we could have been Hugsteads had he not moved.
right.
So here is a picture of.
Quick comment, just to confirm, in Rolette in Westland Cemetery, if you can back up one there, please. There, Garine Marie Mortenstadter, that's Mother Beaver buried there, right? Correct? In
Yes, that is correct.
Mother Beaver in Rolette at the Westland Cemetery. And that's what her
Yes,
headstone, all her headstone says is just that. It's just flat with the earth, Mother Beaver, and then her birth and death date there.
yes, and I appreciate the fact that Michael has volunteered to help with a new project to add, in addition to that, a more descriptive headstone that would provide her real name. So thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
So here we have Anna and Tina Bryn Beaver. Tina, as you may recall in the earlier slide, had come across in 1876 after her father Olaus had come, and Olaus had come on the same ship with Gurina and her children. So ultimately, his daughter became married to Anna Beaver. So that here we have Anna and Tina Beaver's daughter Olga, quite stately, and they lived in and around this Beaver group lived in and around Becker County, stayed there. And next we have, who can read this? I can't see it.
Ollie,
Thank you. Tolly, the one we talked about, the most adventurous one. And here we have about Tolly himself. So as you can see, he did start a major land holding in Dodge County. He was adventurous and he created more land holdings elsewhere. But here's a picture of his probably in-town house in Dodge County in Casson, Minnesota. So he and his wife.
that was the house he retired to.
Okay. And here's a picture of him with his growing family in Dodge County. And despite the fact that he owned properties and visited others elsewhere, he did ultimately return here and is buried in Dodge County. Here we have his son, Oscar and Ethel, because Tolly did go to South Dakota, as I mentioned, and establish some land holdings there, and Oscar and Ethel lived there. And here, in fact, is Tolly Beaver's farm that he purchased and ultimately deeded to his son, Oscar, in Wilmot, South Dakota. So there's a group of beavers there. The original home is on the left here, as you can see the white home over here. And then ultimately, by the early to mid 50s, they built a new home here on the right. And oops. And I will make a comment that very friendly group of beavers always help us out. And that little car in the foreground is where they let us park our RV when we're in town. So now the next we have Halvor Mortensen Beaver. Um, and we don't have a picture of him and his family. We do have his last known address. So he is buried here in Lake Park, right near his mother, Alette, the mother of all of these siblings. We have a picture of his son, Edward Beaver, quite a dapper young man.
A number of Oliver's children ended up living in California.
And here is, while it is Ole Beaver's headstone, I just point out the fact that it's all in Norwegian, because the fact of life that when the Norwegian families came here, they all were very fluent in Norwegian. They expected their family members, their neighbors, and everybody to converse normally in Norwegian, and to the point where even this headstone 1904 is written in Norwegian. And so it was sort of expected that you're part of that culture, you'll learn the language. As with many immigrant families, over time and with succeeding generations, we lost the language for the most part. And so now it's a reminder of the culture that was. Speaking of the culture, they brought their traditions with them here. And we have somebody in this picture that's well known to Mike Oyseth. You want to point her out to you?
That's my grandma sitting at the right there, doing some kind of needlework or handwork of some sort. I believe that those were a couple of sisters by the name of Brevik, who were her roommates. But this photo was taken over in Red Wing, Minnesota, on the river at the Red Wing Ladies Seminary, which was a place she attended for school for a couple of years following high school. And afterwards, she was a country school teacher in Dodge County, and then did a more adventurous thing, which was to go out to western North Dakota and do some homesteading. Lived in a sod shack out there, and we'll see that coming up.
So another thing to point out for those of you who obviously picked it out right away, and that's a D chord that she's playing on the guitar. But aside from that, you look this back at this, the spine of this says Bibelen, which is the Bible in Norwegian. So clearly, it's another indicator of the fact that Norwegians will speak Norwegian and they lived a whole Norwegian lifestyle. Speaking of Norwegians, so the man in the center is Robert Beaver, who is a great grandson of Christian Beaver. So he is a descendant of essentially the Dodge County Beaver group that include both Ole and Polly. And for many, many years, he was the caretaker of the West St. Ola Church Cemetery. And many Beavers are buried there. His wife on the left, Joy Beaver, she continues to attend some of the gatherings we have at Mike Oyseth's house, which is becoming the genealogical party house of Minnesota. And on the right is Beckett Lee, great-great-great-grandson of Burina Beaver, my son. Here we have a typical pioneer hut or home. This is a sod house. When they first came to North Dakota, Dakota Territory, not many trees out there. And so they had to make do with what they had. And so many of you have ancestors who grew up or were born in a sod house, as was my grandmother. And this is what one looked like. This happened to be Clara Beaver Oyseth's family's sod house. Speaking of which, this was a town that was built out here in North Dakota, just as indicative of anything like Rolette, where I'm sitting today. It happened to be a particular town that Clara Beaver Oyseth came to. You want to chat about that, Mike, a little bit?
Well, New England is in, I'm not sure how the North Dakotans pronounce it, Hettinger or Hettinger County, kind of down in the southwest part of the state, quite far west. And that was where some land was available still for homesteading around 1905, 08, that time period. When she went out there with a couple of friends and a couple of cousins and took out claims. And she would walk from her sod house over to this hotel where she had a job cleaning rooms and helping out. I know she supposedly raised chickens on her property that were used in the dining area of this hotel. I made a trip there to New England and talked to the people at the local newspaper office in about around 2000, year 2000. They were tremendously helpful. They just went way out of their way to try to find everything possible that might have some bearing on my grandma's history there.
Thank you. This is another view. We can see what small town life looked turn of the century, just prior to. Kind of desolate out there, but they made the best of it. Just a quick reminder. So towards the end of the emigration of the Beaver family, we had, as I mentioned, Verena Beaver's oldest son, my great-grandfather Martin Beaver, came in 1870. And then in 1875, we had Verena and the rest of her children come over, followed by Tina Bryn. So here is essentially Verena or Mother Beaver and her essentially two families, both from Norway. Her first husband, Ole Kittelsen, died, as you can see, 1865 time frame, and he had most of our relatives there. She remarried 1866 and had two daughters, one of whom passed in childbirth or shortly thereafter, and then Thora. And so when she finally came in 1875, she brought all of these folks with her. So her oldest son, my great-grandfather Martin, and his wife Sophia Beaver, he was from Kongsberg, she was from Fredrikstad, and they married in Becker County, where I said that many of the Beavers landed and stayed. And this is their family. Martin and Sophia, surrounded by their children, most of which were born in Rolette after they moved to North Dakota, with the exception of the youngest three, Emma, Caroline, and Oscar. So here, the two older boys of Verena's family, Martin and Carl, came to Rolette County in the early 1880s and set up and started their families. As you can see, the comment that Carl Beaver opened the first post office in Island Lake, 1888. And he was later known as Carl or Charlie Dugout Beaver. And both of their kids were born in Rolette. Here we have someone that's familiar with most of the folks here in town and descendants of Beavers, Andrew and Emma Beaver. And Andrew was one of the ones who led the charge into Rolette area, but he had some housework to do as he was helping his aunt, which is Olaus Beaver's widow. Olaus passed earlier in Becker County, and he helped his aunt Helga to move out into North Dakota. And so it took him a little longer to join the rest of them. So as you can see, Martin and Carl Beaver came to Rolette 1884. Verena's family came out in 85 and Andrew in 86. And then Andrew and Emma married here in 1889. Here's a strapping young man, a picture of young Andrew Beaver. And here's the family that Andrew and Ingeborg or Emma Bosane created. These are all essentially the pioneer family, one of the many pioneer families, the Giljan, Tostads, and many others that helped to establish life here in Rolette. Each one of them started quite a large group of farmers in this area. And many of the folks that are here in Rolette today, the folks that I'm having lunch with on a daily basis, are descendants of or good friends of these same folks here. And as you can see, they had a lot of kids who had a lot of kids. Here's a picture of Andrew and Emma Beaver and the folks that the family that they raised. When my wife and I visited in 1989, we first came to Rolette to do family history. We were able to meet the last of this group here, the original settlers. Bill Beaver towards the back there, and Benny Beaver were still alive at that time. Here's a depiction of essentially just Rolette County. Many of you are familiar with this, but we've had earlier speakers who talk about Turtle Mountain. Also, we had Carl Dugout Beaver set up the first post office in Island Lake Township, down southeast of Leonard Township. And of course, Leonard is where Rolette is, and much of the history surrounds that area. Here's a larger view, plat map of Leonard Township. It was taken probably in the early 1900s. And if you look here, you can see all the families that were surrounded. We got Andrew Beaver in the middle. There's several locations where Andrew Beaver had land surrounded by the Gilgies and the Tostads. There's Enoch Gilgee and all the rest. So I know we could go on and on for a long time with all the folks on a Zoom call today to talk about where their family members were in this early plot, but we'll save that for another day.
Are you ready for
This is
questions,
just
Randy?
yeah, yes.
Any questions for Randy or Michael? Terrific job, you two. Just marvelous.
Oh, thank you.
For them?
This is just an indicator of life was not easy back in the day, and so if you came out to be a pioneer out to North Dakota, you better be ready, because it was long before Social Security. So it's a good shot. Michael Oyseth wanted to make sure we included this one. And this is a family, the Worrell family, that married into Andrew and Emma's family, because Andrew's son Alfred married Mary Worrell, and this is her family.
Good job. Good job.
Quick comment on that one. I'm not sure. There were two long guns that ultimately made its way to an attic at my dad's house that he'd bought secondhand before they're married. And I have one above in my man cave, and I'm not sure it's that one or the other gun that would have been in the family somewhere. Going back.
Okay, I'll look forward to seeing that when next we're by there with you and your goats.
Yep.
So the Dakotans, so our folks first went into Dakota, as I said, in the early 1880s. Well, things didn't go so well after that. It was quite a hardship they had to go through. Severe droughts, grasshopper swarms came in. My grandmother said that grasshoppers came and ate everything, including the wooden handles of farm tools. And so as a consequence of the 10 years of their nearly 10 years, I read something that from 1885 to 1895, there were only 4 years of productive crops. So as you can imagine, trying to feed your family with that kind of challenge. And so by 1894, the two older brothers, Martin and Carl, had decided they'd had enough. And soon after, Aunt Ingeborg also decided to quit the Dakotas and move back to Minnesota. Another sister, Anna Karina Beaver, moved out to Bellingham, Washington, probably the source of that photo that later showed up. And so really it was only of the Beaver family, only Karina and Andrew Beaver and their descendants who decided to stick it out. Although it was hit and miss. Andrew almost came back too. We'll see that in a second. But I read subsequently that there was a boon crop in 1896 that began the turnaround to help folks make it through the decades thereafter. So unfortunately, these folks didn't quite last that long.
I was
But they
gonna
were in,
mention, I was
Yeah.
gonna mention too, that I read, in I think one of the, WPA 1932 interview, reports that, there was a devastating prairie fire that swept through much of, Leonard Township and burned down barns, destroyed crops, full crops, and a couple of horses were destroyed in the fire. It was just a tremendous setback, all happening very suddenly.
yeah. Speaking of that interview, so here in the early 1930s, there was an interview of Andrew Beaver, and here's some commentary from it. He describes what it was like to move into that area from Minnesota, and what they took with them, and who was first there, and things like that. It makes quite interesting reading if you get a chance to see the whole thing. Here's another synopsis or a piece of it, and you can talk about some of the early pioneer families that were around at that time. Here's some commentary also that he made about moving in and around. And I'll just point out the bottom piece here where he describes there were many years towards the bottom of discouragement, and Mr. and Mrs. Beaver planned to go back to Minnesota. For example, in 1888, everything froze, so there was no crop. So as you can see, not only did Martin and Carl and others leave town, but Andrew himself almost left town. So we almost were the Beavers from Minnesota also. So this is some of the early things that they contended with in trying to raise crops. And so it's better than a hand plow, but still more challenging than we have today. And then as time went on, things got a little bit better as they improved their technology. Here we see Alfred Beaver in 1912 as part of a threshing crew. Here's an early pickup truck, you might say, with grain bags as seats and a box in there as the bed of the truck. You can you can see it's got a rope attached to the bottom, and so they could tow something else with it. So you may do everything you could. Move cold there. This picture is taken roughly 1940, and it's a vintage tractor at that time still in use. And so some of the Beaver family members are depicted here, such as Dwayne and Melvin. Here we are, Beaver family, 1928. And so a lot of the folks in Rolette have been familiar over time with these folks. There's Bill Beaver here in the front, and Gilmore, and Alma, and Stanley Beaver, some of the upstanding citizens of Rolette. On the far right, we see Emma, that's Andrew's widow. And then when my wife and I visited in 1989, we were hosted by Anna Beaver Tostad. And here she is in the front with her cute little black hat. So,
That's
the
my aunt.
upstanding citizen that really helped us out. Here is a little bit later version of the Andrew Beaver family. As you can see, a fine upstanding family in Rolette, and many of you might recognize these folks. I can see Willie Beaver and Alfred and Emma and Lemoyne off to the right in the coveralls. And I'm sure many of you will know these folks better than I. But
Great picture, great picture.
yeah. Here's an overview of Melvin Beaver's farm. Here it says also it's the Achievement Soil Winner for 1968. And over the past 5 days I've been in Rolette, my wife and I have come to have a much greater appreciation for what that might mean. So many folks in the area are quite proud of the productivity they have on their farms, and the increasingly sustainable measures used to maintain those farms over the years. I'm learning phrases like minimum till, no till, things like that.
Were you able to get out there, Randy, while you're up there?
Yes, actually, my wife and I both jumped on a tractor with Cordell, helped us out and showed us a little bit of what that's like.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Here we have a young Lemoyne, Dwayne, Emma, and Melvin. Poor Emma passed away at 16 years of age. And as you can see, Melvin's coat, it may not have been purchased for him originally. And don't forget, we have Nancy, the sheep. And then a little later, you can see them as they're growing to upstanding citizens of themselves. We have Dwayne, Harlan, Ethel, Melvin, Maida, Lemoyne, Alfred, Mary, and Vida. And some more of Andrew Beaver's son family, Alfred and Mary family. Some of you may know Roger Beaver. Well, that's the little one you have right in the foreground.
So the little significance of this picture is that it's 4 generations represented on both sides of mom and dad's family. Roger,
Yes.
youngest, the folks, and then behind him, 2 more generations representing Anderson and Beaver.
And the older woman in the very center there is Emma. That's Andrew Beaver's widow. So
Yep.
yeah, that's the 4th generation. Thank you, Michael. So in conclusion, Beavers did come to America and populated many areas in the Midwest, in particular Minnesota and North Dakota. Here we have a representative family from Rolette. That's Willie and Alma Beaver. As you can see, they're kingly. I believe it was 1977. They were crowned as the king and queen of a Rolette festival of some sort. Michael, you want to say anything about that? You remember that?
Yeah, well, I remember it. I think it was the 50th anniversary of the Rolette, I thought, but I could be
Okay.
mistaken. But I do remember specifically when they were king and queen. So
Okay. And I know they do have a bench that's attributed to them that's sitting right out there off Main Street.
right.
Then, of course, we had Beavers in Dodge County and Becker County, here represented by Clara Beaver Oyseth, daughter of Christian Beaver, and of course, Michael Beaver's grandmother. As you can see, the
Mike
picture's
Oyseth.
taken.
No, Mike
Yes.
Oyseth's grandma.
Yeah.
Yes. And as you can see, the bottom right corner, this picture was taken in Lake Park. So once again, continued connection between Dodge County and Lake Park.
Yeah.
I
Some of
will,
the relatives visited each other.
I will make a
We have a
comment
recent acquisition, and then it came by way of Roger Beaver. It was a letter sent by Andrew C. Beaver from Dodge County, Minnesota, over to Rolette to, who was it? Alfred
yes.
Alfred Beaver up in Rolette, telling about his
The passing of his 2 brothers.
Peter C. Beaver, who died, who was a son of Christian. So there was communication going on between the various locations where beavers were scattered.
Yeah.
And that's some hard evidence of that.
And ultimately, they even found their way out to California. This is my grandmother, Caroline Beaver Burnett. And I know that we indicated Halver Beaver had some folks down in San Diego area. So Beavers and out in Bellingham, Washington. So they got around a bit. So, and this is the woman that really I'll dedicate my role in this to, because she's the one who gave me all the information about Beaver family. She remembered all of her great uncles and aunts, Christian, Tully, Halver, Ole, and all the rest, and really helped me get a good start when I was 16. So
Yeah.
that's all I got. Does anybody have any questions or comments or want to discuss any of this further? Okay. Well, thank you, Paul.
I got
Appreciate
one.
your
You've
time.
been
I got a
upside
question.
down there for a long time. Doesn't the blood rush to your head?
Sort
I've
of
got a
does.
question.
This far north, it's
The-
easy.
The obvious economic status would indicate that the immigrants by and large made it okay. Is that a too much of a conclusion to make? But certainly the pictures would reveal folks that had decent looking clothes and all that must have done pretty well.
Well, I think this was one of the lucky families, but not all. I don't think we can necessarily conclude that all of the Norwegian immigrants did well when they came over. Some struggled. And in my study of Rolette County, the group that were there in 1885 to 1900, there was tremendous turnover. There were 57 individuals born in Norway in Rolette County in 1885. And by 1900, there were only 7 of those still left. And of course, some had died, but many had moved elsewhere, and we're not sure why exactly, but I think some of the hardships that with weather and so forth must have played quite a role.
Thank you. Very good comment, Mike. Other thoughts? Jeff Epping, do you have any question you'd like to raise?
Fascinating. I just have one question generally about surnaming. What is the difference between SEN and SON? Was there anything to it at all?
I have heard theories advanced that, well, if it was SEN, it was more of a Danish orientation, and SON was more Norwegian or Swedish, but I don't think that always was applied. There are always seem to be exceptions to those kinds of generalizations in my research experience. So,
Michelle, do you have any questions? Beckett? I must tell you, Mike and Randy, you fellows did a terrific job putting this together. We are really indebted to you. Not only did you do a good job of explaining your own family, but you gave us all a perspective on what it was like for thousands and thousands of people coming from Norway to America in the 1800s and the different routes they took. So very, very good. Further comments by the three of you? Anything further you want to add?
well, I just appreciate all the help that we've had along the way. I remember passing through Rolette back in about 18 or no, not quite that far back, 1980. It must have been 1998 or 9, something like that. And Randy had already been there, they told me. But I was out west looking at courthouse records and so on for my Oyseth grandfather. And then I came through the top of the state. I stayed overnight in Bottineau. And at the motel there, I got the phone book out and I looked up Beavers in Rolette, and there was Dwayne, and I picked his name out of the bunch and gave him a phone call, and he said, "Oh yeah, come on down." So the next day I was in Rolette, and it was wonderful to meet many people. They were friendly, they were welcoming, they brought out their photos, they provided meals. I stayed, I think, 3 days and just absorbed so much. And you know, genealogy is a very collaborative thing. You get help from all sorts of sources that you might not expect. And if you let them know you're interested and you're doing some work and gathering material, they're oftentimes very helpful.
Thank you. By the way, I'll be up there in 2 weeks. We'll be committing my wife's ashes and my brother's ashes to Westland Cemetery. So we will see a lot of the same folks up there in 2 weeks. So again, thank you all. Terrific afternoon. Look forward to another session next month. Thank you again. We'll see you.
All right,
you,
thanks,
Paul.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.